So here we go, toxoplasmosis in the news. And so there's been a lot of attention paid. How many of you have seen news headlines and that's why you're here today? Yeah, there's some stuff going on out there. And if you haven't heard about it, you will. Because there was just something on ABC News a few days ago. A lot of stuff popped out. In fact, as I was doing research for this talk, more things were popping up each day. And I was like, I can't keep up with all these stories. So there's lots going on. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background so that you understand what some of the thoughts are. So when it comes to parasitology, and I find this fascinating, there's something called the manipulation hypothesis. And so there's this idea that parasites, and we know this is true in several of the parasites. Parasites will invade a host, so they will invade an animal, it can be an insect or a cat or a rat or whatever, and change its behavior. And the hypothesis is that it changes the behavior in order to benefit the parasite. So Dr. Newmark was just talking about rabies. So there's a good example of a virus that invades a host, changes the behavior, it makes it run around, salivate, and how does the virus spread? Through saliva. It makes it run around, bite people, so it spreads the virus, and so it changes the behavior in order to benefit the parasite. And so the question is, do we think toxoplasmosis can change behavior? It's certainly, you end up with cysts in your brain, can they act on the brain to change behavior? And so that was one of the questions that came up. And in fact, it's been shown that toxoplasmosis, and this research is pretty good, toxoplasmosis actually does affect rodents and change their behavior. And so infected rodents will demonstrate innate, meaning naturally reduced fear responses to cat pheromones and cat urine. So if you take a laboratory rat that has never met a cat and you expose it to cat urine, it is afraid and it will try to avoid it. It's never seen a cat, doesn't know anything about cats, and yet it will avoid that urine naturally as part of something that it just has inherited. And so when a mouse or a rat is infected with toxoplasmosis, it actually loses that innate fear, and it is actually attracted to cat urine. So it will hang out in the cat urine corner. And so they did this sort of thing where they created this big round, it was a big round circle, and they stuck bobcat urine at one end of it, and they stuck rabbit urine at the other end, which they should not be afraid of, and they're not. And the uninfected rodents ran this way and spent a lot of time over here. The infected rodents went over there and hung out in the cat urine because they were no longer afraid of it. They also demonstrated less learned fear. And so they took collars and towels and soaked them in cat urine and exposed them to that. And the ones who were not infected were afraid of the collars and towels that were infected. The ones that were infected were not afraid. And then the ones that were infected also didn't learn to be afraid of just a regular old collar or towel, whereas the other ones did. So they failed to learn to be afraid of something that smelled like cat urine as well. And instead, they found it really sexy and hung out in the cat urine corner. The other thing that they did is they demonstrated more risky behavior. They jump around more in front of a cat. They became uncoordinated. They were like attracting attention more. And so this idea that the parasite got into the rat brain or the mouse brain and actually makes them attracted to cats. They called it fatal attraction. And so, of course, the next question, if you're a crazy scientist, is what? Does this happen in people? So chronic toxoplasmosis in humans does exist. If you have antibodies, you may have tissue cysts that are in your brain or in muscle tissue, and in most people, they're going to do nothing. Again, the prevalence, anywhere from 14 to 22% in the US, much higher in other parts of the world. People are usually asymptomatic, causes no disease whatsoever in people, and actually protects you essentially against later infection or congenital infections if you're a woman getting pregnant. In immune-compromised individuals, particularly AIDS patients, we became aware of the fact that those cysts can come out of dormancy. They can come out of your brain and rupture, essentially, and the parasite can start replicating again and causing disease in people. And so that can be significant disease in these individuals. And so it became a question, one, what do we do about that? How much of a concern is that? What do we do? How do we treat it? Should we be worrying about this? And then the other is it causing other disease that we don't know? Especially if you go back to the idea, and I'll back up to look at our mice, maybe not, I won't. If you go back to the idea that in the mouse it affects behavior, can it affect behavior in people? And so the question after that was, can it make people attracted to cat pee? Does it make people act like cats, eat off the floor? And somebody was telling me a story at the dinner the other night, I know who it was, about when they were a cat for Halloween as a child and demanded to eat off the floor that night, and their mother let them do that. And I thought of that as I was writing this. Come on, you guys all know you wanted to do that at some point, eat out of the cat bowl. And so the question became, does it affect crazy cat ladies? And so is there something about toxoplasmosis that may make people attracted to the smell of cat pee? Could it be playing a role in hoarding? Could it be playing a role in some mental illnesses where hoarding cats becomes an issue? Does it make people into crazy cat ladies? So what do they do next? Get some cat pee and have people smell it. Silly you. Come on, guys. So, and you're going to see this name come up again and again as I'm talking. Does Toxoplasma affect how humans react to cat pee? And so this guy got some cat pee and did some titers on people, and he took Toxoplasma negative people and Toxoplasma positive people and exposed them to cat pee to find out if they were more attracted. And indeed, this is interesting. Men that had Toxoplasma positive titers actually were attracted to the cat's pee smell. Women were not. So it kind of went against the crazy cat lady, but it supports the crazy cat man theory. They tried it with other species. So they collected urine from all sorts of animals and did the same thing, and there was absolutely no change. There was no difference between the people that had toxo and the people that didn't. But for cat urine, there was a difference. What does this mean? I don't think we really know, honestly. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about research and how to think about it. But it was, I think, an interesting finding, and at least it didn't support the idea that we're making crazy cat ladies out of Toxoplasma positive people. But this guy, and there's his name, and I don't know how to pronounce it, Dr. Flegr, he's the one who shows up a lot with this research. So he is Czechoslovakian, and he has done a lot of research looking at behavioral conditions in humans, mental illness in humans, and whether or not toxoplasmosis may play a role. And so he's popping up a lot in popular science. This article came out of Atlantic Monthly in March of 2012, and he's really interested. And it all started because as early as 1896, there was someone who questioned whether schizophrenia might be related to a parasite. And so he's had some issues in his life. He talks about it in the article. And he wondered whether he had a parasite that might indeed make him act out in certain ways, because he was a little disruptive in adolescence and early adult. And indeed, he went looking, and indeed, he's Toxoplasma positive. And so he started questioning, and then he started doing some studies to try and investigate this. So human behaviors in question that he's looked at, schizophrenia, and I'm going to come back to that one because that's the one where there may actually be some connection. He's looked at suicide risk. He's looked at car accidents and reaction times. The idea being that reflexes seem to be compromised in people who are Toxoplasma seropositive, so they have positive titers. Looking at risk-taking and novelty-seeking, that idea of changing the behavior of the rat or the mouse. Does it change human behavior? And certainly problem solving and cognition. There have been questions about whether it compromises humans' ability to kind of reason through problems. And there's a bunch of different studies. He did this through surveys. So he used students, military people, a couple of other groups, and then asked them long questions about their behaviors and their choices and what they do. And then he took their titers to see who was positive and who was negative. The one that has popped up most frequently, and that there actually has been something called a meta-analysis of, the one that has had the most broad-based research is schizophrenia. And there does seem to be an increased risk. There's a higher number of schizophrenics that are let me put it the other way. If you are Toxoplasma positive, you have a higher risk of having schizophrenia by 2.3 times higher. at least in the population that he surveyed. Now, I want to kind of break this down for a minute, because just because you have two things that pop up doesn't mean that there's a cause and effect relationship. And we all learned that pretty early on in trying to look at research. So there are several ways to do research. And one of the things we want to talk about is peer-reviewed journals. So those are articles where experts review them. So somebody writes an article based on research, and experts in the field review them before they ever go to publication. So that's considered better research than non-peer-reviewed. Somebody's read it and said, a panel of people have read it and said, okay, this is good. Evidence-based is even better than that, where what they do is they take a bunch of different studies, they do a meta-analysis, which is what was done with that schizophrenia piece, and they tried to analyze a large number of studies, verifying that indeed what was found across the board was the same and could be supported by multiple pieces of information. Open source publishing is relatively new with the internet, and it's a point of concern. Open source publishing usually has no or very limited peer review, and anyone can kind of go online and publish their study without it being critically reviewed. And there's more and more of this out there. The other thing about it is it's available to everyone. So you don't pay a journal, because essentially anybody can publish. And in some cases, these journals actually collect a fee to publish, and a big fee to publish. And so there's a lot of journals out there, especially if you're not in an academic institution, that if you go looking for articles, this may be the only articles you get, are the ones that people were allowed to publish without perhaps the same level of peer review as ones that show up in some of the scientific journals. And then, of course, there's popular science in the news. How many of you have ever been interviewed by a reporter and a story went out there and there were just glaring errors that made you want to crawl back in bed? Yeah, most of you are nodding. Like, that can be really disheartening, and it happens all the time because, and particularly in the popular media, they're trying to sell papers or trying to get people to watch their TV station, and there may be a lack of peer review. Fair enough? So quick nod to peer review-based research, and a quick nod to epidemiology, that behaviors and conditions are complex. And so one of the things with schizophrenia is that it also, socioeconomic status, genetics, and experience all play a role. And so yes, there may be a higher level of Toxoplasma positive people and a higher level of schizophrenics, but a lot of times that's also associated with socioeconomic status. Toxo in particular is higher in urban areas where there's higher concentrations of people, and in people with lower educational levels. And so there may be multiple factors. And my best explanation for this is, let's say, okay, I'm a redhead naturally, I get a little help these days, but let's say I'm in gym class and I'm really bad at volleyball. And so, and there's two other redheads in my class and they're really bad at volleyball. And so you decide to write a study that redheads are bad at volleyball. Because 3 out of 23 people are redheaded and bad at volleyball. Well, what if I say that, what about if we're identical twins? So maybe our genetics now played a role in all of us being bad at volleyball. Does that make sense? Or maybe all 3 of us we just got to this school and we never played volleyball before 7th grade. And everybody else has been playing volleyball since kindergarten because they all were at this school and they had better training. And so it's very easy to jump to a conclusion if you've got 2 things and say, well, these 2 things are connected, when really they're not, because there's other factors that are involved. And for both toxoplasmosis and schizophrenia, there are complicated factors that play a role, and it may be that some of those overlap. And even Flegr says that. If you actually read what he wrote versus what the newspaper writes, that is absolutely in his work as well. So very small numbers of toxopositive people actually manifest mental or behavioral disorders. So we have a lot of people that are seropositive, very few of them actually have mental illness. The other thing is that the majority of schizophrenics are Toxoplasma negative. So if you look at it the other way, the vast majority of them are not positive for Toxoplasma titers. And the other question that I got from somebody yesterday, and I went back and looked, is indeed countries that have the highest rate of Toxoplasma positive serologies do not have higher rates of schizophrenia than the US. Like, the rates are the same, even though their numbers of people that are positive for Toxoplasma are much higher. So it begs the question if there is another factor, some kind of genetic predisposition or no association. It's certainly something to pay attention to and to be concerned about, but it's not an earth-shattering, we don't all have to be afraid at this point, I don't think, based on what's out there. But I certainly think it's something to watch. The other thing that they've looked at, and this is really, really recent information, is that toxoplasmosis in people, the quiet subclinical form, the question is whether it can play a role in dopamine and whether this might be the connection. So if you stick Toxoplasma in a petri dish, which is a little science dish, it does affect the amount of dopamine made in mammalian cells. And dopamine has a lot to do with your fear responses, your sense of pleasure, your sense of paying attention to things. And so dopamine does have a really active role, and there is a question of whether toxoplasmosis may affect dopamine. Now again, in a petri dish, there is one study which was an open source publication online that says indeed they think it does, but that's really new. And we do know that in schizophrenia, dopamine is increased. That we do know for sure. And so there may be a connection that's connected through dopamine. Again, but not all schizophrenics are toxoplasma positive, and actually very few of them are. But we're seeing these sorts of headlines. Harmful parasites in cat poop are widespread. Toxoplasma oocyst is a public health problem. This is the kind of stuff that's coming out. And I've already heard from some communities where people are, it's becoming the thing to go after feral cats again, community cats. And so the concern whether they're going to be a source of toxoplasma and whether that means everybody's going to develop schizophrenia in that neighborhood or other diseases from toxoplasma. So this actually came out of a parasitology peer-refereed journal, and I'm just going to read it out loud because this is kind of the vision that I'm most afraid of because I think it's a narrow vision. Public health policies should prohibit the practice of allowing pet cats to roam. Organizations and individuals that feed feral cats are unwittingly contributing to the dissemination of toxoplasma by sustaining artificially dense populations of a definitive host of this protozoal parasite. So basically, the parasitologist came out saying that we shouldn't feed feral cats or outdoor cats or roaming cats. This sounds familiar. To me, it sounds familiar in talking about TNR and all of those questions. And I say we need to be a little bit more creative than that because we know that trapping and euthanizing is not humane or effective. And we know that ignoring the problem and not feeding the cats is not going to fix the problem. They're still going to be out there. They're just not going to be fed. I mean, this to me implies let's stop feeding the cats and just let them die off, which is not going to happen. So we need to be smart about it. And through spay-neuter, we've been smart about it. Let's target those communities. Let's reduce populations.